Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. As you might know, the museum boasts a renowned collection of Edgar Allan Poe letters, manuscripts, and other handwritten documents. But tonight I'm going to showcase my favorite Edgar Allan Poe letter in the collection. It's one that the museum has had its eye on for the better part of a century. Not just because of what it says, but because of what it's written on. And that will be the subject of tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So here it is. This is a letter that Edgar Allan Poe wrote November 20th, 1848, to his foster uncle, Edward Valentine. Now I say he's his foster uncle. Edward Valentine was Poe's foster mother, Frances Allan's first cousin. And he was kind of like an uncle to Poe. Poe didn't have a lot of family in the area. His sister lived nearby, but Edward Valentine became like an uncle to the young Poe, took him out horseback riding, taught him how to box, which is probably not a good idea for a 4-year-old kid, but also took Poe to country stores when Poe's 3-4 years old, and he would amaze all the people at the store by reading out loud from the newspaper. Poe's a very precocious little kid and became attached to Edward Valentine. But after Poe had his falling out with his foster father and took off and started a new life, it doesn't seem like he really had a lot of contact with Edward. In fact, this letter might be the first that Valentine heard from Poe in something like 20 years. So when Poe wrote it, he just didn't send it directly to Valentine. He thought he should have an intermediary. Even though he hadn't met her at the time, there was Susan Archer Talley, who was Valentine's niece. And she was a poet. She was a friend of Poe's sister. So he wrote to her and said, I need you to forward this letter to Edward Valentine for me with sort of a letter recommendation. Tell him that I'm the real deal, that I know what I'm talking about. And we have Talley's own words describing this. She said this was the first she'd ever heard from Poe. So she did this. She packed up the letter, sent Edward Valentine. And this is what it says. Poe was writing to him out of the blue, ever not seen him or spoken to him in decades. And it's a very sort of poetic letter. It starts out, after a long and bitter struggle with illness, poverty, and the 1,000 evils which attend them, I find myself in length in a position to establish myself permanently and to triumph over all difficulties. And Poe knows what he's talking about. This has been a rough couple of years. A year previous, he'd lost his wife. Then he'd fallen in love with his nurse, and she rejected him. He fell in love with a lady called Annie Richmond. She rejected him, wouldn't leave her husband for him. Then he fell in love with Sarah Helen Whitman. And just a couple weeks before he wrote this letter, she rejected his marriage proposal, so he tried to end it all by overdosing on laudanum. But just 1 week, 7 days before he wrote this letter, she accepted his proposal. And things were finally starting to look up, and we see that hint of optimism in the opening lines of this letter. When he talks about establishing himself permanently, he has a plan. He wants to start his own magazine. He's already got a name for it. It's called The Stylus. And he's been going around trying to round up subscriptions. But he also needs some mega investors. Poe doesn't have 2 cents to rub together. He's living in a rented cottage in the Bronx, traveling the country, trying to raise money, but also trying to find a new wife. So it's a very busy, hectic time for him while he's looking for a major financial donor, and he thinks that Edward Valentine can do it. So he needs to write the perfect letter asking for money. And he really lays it on thick. this is how it goes. I'll just start a little bit back before I left off. And to triumph over all difficulties, if I could but obtain from some friend a little pecuniary aid. So how much money does he need? Just a little bit. And here's the good guilt trip. In looking around for such a friend, I could think of no one, with the exception of yourself, whom I see the least prospect of interesting in my behalf. And even as regards yourself, I confess that my hope is feeble. In fact, I've been so long depressed. It'll be a most difficult thing for me to rise, and rise I never can without such aid as I now entreat at your hands. I call to mind, however, that during my childhood you were very kind to me, and I believe very fond of me. For this reason, and because I really do not know where else to turn for the assistance I so much need at this moment, I venture to throw myself upon your generosity and ask you to lend me $200. Now, remember when I mentioned earlier that he was living in a rented cottage? Rent was $100 a year. $200 is a lot of money. The most Poe ever made in a year was when he was working at Graham's Magazine. That's about $800. $200 is a lot of money. Now, he thinks that, Edward Valentine's rich, he might be able to spare it. So he continues. With this sum, I should be able to take the first steps in an enterprise where there can be no doubt of my success, and which, if successful, would in 1 or 2 years ensure me fortune and a very great influence. I refer to the establishment of a magazine, for which I already have a good list of subscribers, in which I send you a prospectus. If for the sake of auld lang syne you will advance me the sum needed, there are no words which can express my gratitude. So he says he's sending a prospectus. In fact, he wrote this on a rare surviving prospectus for that new magazine he wants to start called The Stylus. He'd printed it before in a newspaper back in 1843, so 5 years earlier, and then the very beginning of January of 1848, the year he wrote this letter, he printed it out in this format so he could solicit investors by writing the letter on a prospectus. So there's maybe only 3 or 4 copies of this that survive. Of course, this is one of them. And it's written on a letter that has a great Richmond and Virginia connection, a connection to Poe's childhood, which was appropriate to the Poe Museum here in Richmond. So Poe really knows how to ask for some money, but how'd it turn out? Not so well. First of all, I should mention that his engagement to Sarah Helen Whitman, the one that started 7 days before he wrote this letter, only lasted for 1 month. She broke it off. She'd heard Poe had a drink, and she said, "There's nothing I can do for you. It's over." And this letter, Edward Valentine, who was like an uncle to Poe when he's growing up, who'd known Poe since he was just a little kid, didn't even bother to respond to him. Instead, he wrote to Susan Talley. And his answer is right down here. And he says, "It is not within my power to aid Mr. Poe." So he gives a little explanation about how all of his money is tied up right now. And he asked Susan Talley to just sort of pass the message on to Edgar. So he never directly wrote him back about this. As far as we know, this is the last contact Poe ever had with his foster uncle, one of the last surviving members of the Allan and Valentine family, the people who reared him since he was a little kid, since his mother died when he was 2 years old. So things aren't looking good for old Edgar. But don't worry. The following year, he finally did find a wife, a woman who agreed to marry him, his old sweetheart, Elmira Royster Shelton. I'll have to tell you more about her later, or you can learn more in previous episodes of the Curator's Crypt. And he also found a financial backer who's willing to help Poe get his magazine finally off the ground. And then he died. 10 days before he was going to get married, he died, and he never got to issue a single issue of that magazine. So it's a bit of a downer, I guess. But so this letter passed down through the family, and in 1923, a year after the Poe Museum opened, the Poe Museum actually wrote to the owners of this letter and said, we hear from Susan Talley's family that you guys have this letter from Edgar Allan Poe. We're really interested in it. In fact, they would have seen it published in this book. This is a 1902 book by James Harrison, The Life and Letters of Edgar Allan Poe. And Harrison had been in touch with the Valentine family and had reprinted the letter right here. So this letter was out there, and the Poe Museum wanted it for their new collection. And in 1924, so 99 years ago, they actually wrote to him and offered him $50 for this letter. It didn't work. The owner didn't sell. But let's fast forward to Poe's bicentennial year, 2009. And this letter had still stayed in the family, went all the way to Edward Valentine's great-great-great-granddaughter, who used to keep it in a cabinet in her living room and would show it to guests sometimes. And she read about the work that the Poe Museum was doing to celebrate Edgar Allan Poe's bicentennial, and she called us and said, I've got this great letter, and I think it should be shared with the world. I think that you should see it. So we put it on display. We put it on display again 3 years later for the museum's 90th anniversary. But at the time, she told us, well, I can't donate the letter to you. My dearly departed aunt gave this to me years ago, back in the 1970s, and she said this is a very important letter, can never leave the family. So I can loan it to you, but I can't give it to you. But the good news is she kept excellent records of this letter. And these are some of the things that came with the letter. And we have excellent provenance. Everything about the history of the letter, where it's been displayed over the years. Even have copies of the letters that the Poe Museum sent to her ancestor asking for this letter. And one thing we found, that this dear lady's dearly departed aunt was trying to sell the letter to everybody she could find back in the 1970s. She offered it to the University of Virginia, she offered it to the Poe Museum, but when the current owner looked through these letters, she said, well, maybe it's not so bad that I go ahead and donate to the Poe Museum. Since she was trying to sell it, she told me not to sell it, but she was trying to sell it. So Edward Valentine's great-great-great-granddaughter ended up giving this to the museum because she thought that this deserves to be shared with the world, deserves to be seen. And today you can come to the Poe Museum and see this, not just the letter, not just this rare surviving prospectus for Poe's Dream magazine, but also Edward Valentine's reply to Poe. And if you can't visit the Poe Museum in person, you can see it on our website at poemuseum.org. But also, if you have a rare Edgar Allan Poe letter just collecting dust, why not donate to the Poe Museum? And if you'd like to help the museum preserve precious Poe pieces like these, don't forget to contribute or become a member at poemuseum.org. Until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.